You're watching Cover to Cover, our guide to the Sikh and Punjabi books that you need to read. This week we're introducing Love and Courage by Jagmeet Singh. This is the softback edition and this memoir was published in 2019. Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the New Democratic Party, the NDP, in Canada. He first trained as a criminal defense lawyer and practiced for many years before being elected as a member of the provincial parliament, an MPP, in 2011. He became head of the NDP in 2017 and has now been sitting as a member of the state parliament for, I think, a little over a year. For people across North America who were familiar with Jagmeet Singh or had any remote interest in politics, the publishing of this book was incredibly anticipated so that they could get to see a little bit more, perhaps, of an insight into who Jagmeet Singh was and is, and perhaps which direction he was going to go into. For members of the Sikh community or people who were friends and familiar with Jagmeet Singh prior to that, this book also was highly anticipated to see what it was that this young maverick renegade of the political world in the West was going to be putting into print. To some extent, this book may have let some of those readers down because, as Jagmeet Singh says in the opening pages, this is not a political memoir. This is not a book as I had perceived it would probably be, a behind-the-scenes tell-all of how Jagmeet Singh came to rise so rapidly and become a leader of a third political party in Canada, but one that actually has real scope of influencing change and becoming the voice of Canadian politics. Instead, this book actually tells the story of Jagmeet Singh's upbringing and how he came to find himself in the political world at all. And in so doing, I think it actually gives us more of an insight into who he is and what his politics are and the direction that the NDP now may go in, if you're able to read and analyze his work in Love and Courage accordingly. So straight off the bat, Love and Courage is approximately 300 pages and is split into three fairly equal parts. Each of which consists of 5 chapters except the final part, which has a total of 7 chapters. These chapters tell the story chronologically of Jagmeet Singh's upbringing in Canada, of the troubles and strife and celebrations that his family experienced as he was growing up as somebody in the 1980s and 1990s. It then goes on to tell the story of him as a young adult and his move into becoming a criminal defense lawyer before finally concluding on how he enters into the world of politics. Throughout this work, there are umpteen stories, analogies, and little tidbits of how Jagmeet Singh's mind really works, and a lot of really frank insights into his family life, which I'm pretty sure can't have been easy for his parents or his siblings to necessarily stomach. But in Jagmeet's own words, paraphrasing, that is something that is required if you're to evolve, to confront problems. And in that light, reading Love and Courage, it fits the subtitle that comes underneath it: My Story of Family, Resilience, and Overcoming the Unexpected. The release and publication of this book found column inches aplenty, specifically in regards to one episode that Jagmeet talks about in this book, that he was sexually assaulted as a young teenager by a teacher of martial arts whom he and his family had trusted. whilst that is a very sensitive topic, it actually doesn't take up a huge amount of this book. And I have been quite surprised and actually aghast at reading so many reviews that focus and revolve around this one incident. Particularly because my reading of this book is that the entire story and this memoir is the story of the love and relationship between a child and their parent. So, before I start to explain what that means, let me just backtrack a tiny little bit. I've actually met Jagmeet Singh a number of times. I don't think he will ever remember the first time I met him, because I was one of probably dozens of people that he shook hands with on a particular night in Toronto in 2011. However, I have since had the pleasure to meet him, I think on about 3 or 4 occasions, twice of which have involved me sitting on a panel at public events where he is speaking and I am one of the other panelists. I found him to be incredibly polite, very well read, well versed on Sikh ideology, and pretty much what you see when you look at Jagmeet on media coverage. He is a very polished politician. It's not that I didn't like Jagmeet, but that he fitted into this nice pigeonhole that I have in my head of politicians who come from a Sikh background. He was better than most of them because he talks the talk. However, I still saw him as being somebody who was too smooth, too polished, and doesn't really let their emotions or their real feelings come to the fore. And for me, that's always a troubling sight, particularly from politicians. And politicians of all backgrounds live that life today. Very few of them actually say what they want to believe. They're always living from one election to the other, which is kind of understandable too. However, having read this book, and I literally bought it the week it was published and available in the United Kingdom, I devoured it over the course of 4 or 5 days, twice over. I have changed my mind. I find now Jagmeet Singh an incredibly admirable person who is in politics for the right reasons. Now, before I start gushing too wildly about Jagmeet Singh, this is about the book, Love and Courage. And on that note, the book is not without its flaws. While Jagmeet Singh's decision to pretty much write the book himself is to be acknowledged and commended, it does mean that it is not the superb read of a memoir that you would hope for. There are occasions throughout the book where certain incidents or accounts are being shared that seem to come out of nowhere and end out of nowhere. They are kind of broadly linked into certain chapters, but included because they have some relevance. A more stern editing of the work, I think, could have done away with those. A number of the Sikh terminology that Jagmeet Singh introduces through this work in the English medium, I find questionable. It is, of course, open to interpretation what English language we use for words such as Chardi Kala, but I found them a little bit too North American for my particular tastes. And while that still, of course, doesn't take away from the work itself, this isn't meant to be a glossary and dictionary for Sikh terminology, I think it does maybe cloud the occasional reader who is not of a Sikh background or is of a Sikh background and doesn't understand Sikh ideology in any great depth. And I probably would have preferred that he had given more open or broad interpretations in this work. As an individual, Jagmeet Singh himself is, of course, flawed. We're all human beings, and this book doesn't try to hide that. It doesn't try to showcase himself as being the hero and the best individual around. He does present his own flaws to a certain extent, and that is actually par for the course with this book. Really, what this book, as I've been saying to people who I've told about it in person, what this book is really all about is the relationship between a child and their parent and the sacrifice that takes place here in a role reversal, one that perhaps many of us are going to have to endure someday. And actually I found, I think unintentionally from their part, that there is an analogy to be drawn there between the politician or the representative of people, and the citizen, the people themselves, and the sacrifices that individuals like Jagmeet Singh do make in their lives so that people, we citizens, have rights and freedoms accorded to us. There's quite a lot to unpack in this book from that perspective, and so I would definitely encourage anybody who's interested in politics, in understanding politicians of a Sikh background, and of course anyone who's interested in Canadian politics, to pick up and read Love and Courage by Jagmeet Singh. But we want to know what you think, so please leave us a comment below and share your thoughts on this great piece of work. Join us again here at the Naujawani YouTube channel. Subscribe so you don't miss another episode of Cover to Cover, our guide to the Sikh and Punjabi books that you need to read.